Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along this evening. My name's Rachel Clark, and I'm a member of Compass Bristol and West, who are hosting tonight's event. Nationally and locally, Compass is an organisation that really wants change. We want to bring together people and parties to ensure we have a new kind of politics after the next election. We want a more democratic, more equal and more sustainable society, overcoming tribal loyalties and doing what is needed to get a progressive government in power at the next election. If we divide, then they, the Tories, will conquer, and Compass's aim is to work together to stop that happening. Just a couple of housekeeping rules about tonight. If we could keep it civil and courteous in the chat and if asking questions. If you do want to ask a question in the chat, please can you prefix it with a capital Q so that we know it's a question and not a comment. If you would like to introduce yourself in the chat or say anything about while you're here, please do so. And we are recording tonight's event, so if you do not want to be seen, please turn off your video. I'm very pleased to say that Claire Young has kindly agreed to chair this evening's event. Claire is councillor for Frampton Cotterell and leader of the Liberal Democratic Group on South Gloucestershire Council. Thank you so much, Claire, for giving up your time this evening to be with us. I will now hand over to you to introduce Stephen, this evening's candidate.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome to everyone to tonight's online hustings. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Stephen Williams. He's a former Avon and Bristol councillor. He was at the time the youngest of any party. He was a group leader, and then he was the MP for Bristol West for 10 years. While he was the first openly gay MP for the Liberal Democrats, and he was awarded the UN medal by the World Health Organization for campaigning on public health. And while he was an MP, he was a Minister for Housing and Communities. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Stephen to introduce himself.
Thanks very much, Claire, and thanks, Compass, for organising this event, which we've exchanged lots of messages about over the last couple of months. It's a great shame we can't do it in person. In a way, I think it would have been quite good to have had the candidates from progressive parties together as well, because one of the things I learned in politics a long time ago, and Claire mentioned in her introduction that I was a very young councillor in Bristol back in the 1990s on Avon County Council, but there is actually quite a lot of common ground in between councillors and MPs from different parties, and we sometimes dwell too much on the differences, and they tend to get aggravated. We do have a lot in common, and I think our electoral system forces both us and the media to portray politics as a clash, and not necessarily a clash of ideas. Quite often it's a clash of personalities, and I think that turns a lot of people off. So I do welcome the approach of Compass to try and have a conversation in between the different political traditions of the centre and centre-left in British politics. Obviously, my liberal tradition has been around a long time. I also regard myself as a social democrat. I mean, I was very saddened just a couple of days ago, to hear of the death of Shirley Williams. He was somebody who spent over 5 decades flying the progressive flag in British politics, both for the Labour Party, the SDP, and the Liberal Democrats. It's a great shame that she wasn't our first woman Prime Minister, rather than somebody else who I won't mention. So I do feel there's a lot that we have in common in between the Lib Dems, the Labour Party, the Green Party. I'm Welsh, so I have friends who are standing currently as Plaid Cymru candidates in the Senedd elections in Wales. And there is a lot we have in common about having a more socially just society and having a greener future as well. This particular regional election in the west of England, of course, is a much narrowly focused election in terms of the power that the west of England mayor has, which are over the local economy, over transport, over land use, and over skills as well. But those areas touch the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in our region. And I do think it's important that we manage somehow to achieve the election of a progressive mayor to lead the west of England going forward, because it is an incredible opportunity to make a difference for people. And it's an opportunity that has been squandered, if I may say so, in the last 4 years by the first mayor of the West of England, which a Centre for Cities think tank report yesterday, assessing what the public thought of all of the regional mayors, including the mayor of London, which of course is a similar position, and found that only 7% of the public of the West of England had any idea who the current mayor of the West of England is. And Tim Bowles, just in case anyone is among that 7%, or is not in that 7% who knows who he is, has squandered that opportunity in the last 4 years. He could have done huge things in public transport and in greening our local economy, and he's not used the powers that are available to him, even less so than ask for more powers that could have been devolved to him. I want to be a quite different mayor. I want to be an energetic and engaging and ambitious mayor for the West of England. And I want to make sure that our recovery from the twin shocks of exiting the European Union, which I think was a total disaster for our country, and the pandemic shock of the last 13 months, that recovery in what is England's most prosperous region outside London is both green and it's socially just as well. Because although we are the most prosperous region in the country, we still have pockets of deprivation and relative poverty, both in Bristol and in Bath and in some of the villages too, where it's incredibly difficult for people, for instance, to aspire to own or rent a home of their own in the place where they grew up. So I've published my manifesto. It was published online last week. It's on my website, stephenwilliams.org.uk, if you want to look at it, and I'll pop a link in the chat shortly. And we had the media launch today on College Green in front of the Council House in City Hall in Bristol. So you might see something about it on the BBC at some point. But some of the headline things from that are setting up a Centre for Green Technological Excellence. I want the West of England to be the green pioneer in the West of England, where we'll bring together the universities, our top companies and training providers to craft the products and services and training packages that we need in order to have a more sustainable future. I want to have the equivalent of what the Northern Powerhouse has and what the West Midlands Engine has, and that's a regional investment fund. This is something Tim Bowles could have asked for from the British Business Bank, but he hasn't. So I'm saying I want a £100 million fund, which is pro rata roughly to what those other regions have got, to invest in new innovative businesses in the West of England. I want there to be a transport revolution in this area, and we sorely need one, because Bath and Bristol probably are the most poorly served large and small cities in the country by their bus and railway networks. So I want to take back control of the bus network under the franchising powers that Tim Bowles could have taken up and has chosen not to. They have them in London, and Andy Burnham, the Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester, is taking them up there, and I want to take them up here as well, so we can cap the fares, plan the routes, and transition away from diesel buses far sooner than would otherwise happen. I want to have major investment in the rail network as well, new services and new stations, and to separately fund and champion cycling and walking, which gets relatively little attention compared to other ways of moving around. I want to make sure, as I said, that people are able to afford to buy or rent their own home in the West of England. And one of the ways I want to do that is to set up a big social enterprise, West of England Homes, which will use the land acquisition powers and the public land that is available across the West of England to build some homes for sale, some homes for private rental, because that's important for flexibility for young people, and to use the surplus that's generated by those activities to invest in social housing let at a social rent. But above all, I just think that this region deserves someone who's going to stand up for it in London. We are the Cinderella in terms of government investment, whether it's in public transport or other government investment or inward investment projects, and that's because we've not shouted loud enough in London and Whitehall about why we're a great place to invest in. We haven't had a regional champion for the last 4 years. As I say, I want to use all of my experience that I've garnered both locally. I know this area inside out. I've lived here since I was an 18-year-old, and as well as serving at both levels of government, I've worked in the private sector, both in Bristol and in South Gloucestershire and in Bath during my career before I became a Member of Parliament. So I know how the economy works in this region. I know how government could work in this region, and I know how national government works as well. And if I'm elected, I will hopefully be able to demonstrate that politics can be a force for good, but not just reliant on one person to prove that, because I will want to work with everybody. When I was on Avon Council, I learned very early in my mid-20s that by working with people from other parties, you can get more done. And I'm going to mention the C word, which some of you may not like. Even during the coalition, I think working with other parties, we did get some good liberal things done, even if we had to hold our nose about lots of other things that, of course, a liberal government on their own would not have done. But that's the price you pay for compromising with other people. I'll be a mayor who does engage with all of the communities right across our region. It's a very mixed community, from inner city, multicultural Bristol to small villages in Somerset and Gloucestershire that are poorly served by public transport. I want to be a mayor for everybody. I've got a vision about how I want to achieve a transformation in the west of England. I just hope I get the opportunity in 3 weeks today, actually, to put that vision into effect. So I hope that warms some of you up, and I look forward to the questions you're going to ask me. You on mute, Claire?
Yeah, that had to happen.
We're all going to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks very much, Stephen, for that introduction. Before we move to the questions in the chat, I've got some questions from Compass that they'd like me to ask. So the first is about universal basic income. What are your views on UBI?
I'm a convert, is the honest and straightforward answer. I used to be quite skeptical about it because the principle of UBI is you give a basic amount of income to every single citizen, whether they are incredibly rich or not. And I used to be skeptical about that because I wasn't sure of the advantages of giving the Duke of Beaufort £1,000 a year when you could give much more than that to people who are struggling in Barton Hill or Twerton. What changed my mind was actually the pandemic, when so many people fell between the cracks of what state support has been available. And I'm sure we all know people amongst our neighbours perhaps who have gone through the pandemic on full pay, but maybe working from home or maybe not working and still been on full pay. Some people who've been furloughed and have been on 80% of their pay, but there have been other people, particularly who are self-employed or just in between jobs, who've got zilch from the system. Mm-hmm. And if they end up on universal credit, it's simply not enough to get you through the everyday needs of life. So I became a convert to universal or unconditional basic income is the other way of describing UBI for that reason, because there are so many people who've lost out. And if we had that sort of cushion or floor beneath which nobody could fall, I think it would make a difference. So I did sign up months ago, in fact, to the National UBI campaign and pledge my support for it. And I've specifically put in my manifesto that I would seek the power from central government to run a regional trial of it here in the west of England.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. I think you've probably covered all the points, because I was going to go on to ask you about the pros and cons. Is there anything else you wanted to add at that point, or do you think you've already covered them?
No, I think so. I mean, it has been trialed now in several American cities and small towns. So if they can do it in America, I don't see why we can't trial it here.
Okay, thank you. And you've already said you would push for a pilot in the
Yeah.
region.
And that's all you can do, of course, because it's not something that's within the current remit of anybody in regional or local government to just introduce. It is something you'd have to ask central government for the power to do so, because you'd have to have access to the income tax system and the benefit system to make it work.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on to electoral reform then. Obviously, Compass campaign for electoral reform. Do you think our current first past the post system has any benefits?
No. I mean, I've won elections under first past the post 3 times as a councillor and twice as an MP, and I've been thrashed under elections under first past the post as well. But the point is, first past the post only just about works if you think choice in life is limited to 2 things. You know, to the Whig and Tory party, or the Liberal and Conservative party, or the Labour and Conservative party. Now, if you think your life is about more than being forced into having 2 choices, then first past the post simply doesn't work. Your politics is about more than a dog race or a horse race. It's about pluralism. It's about the fact that people can be liberal, can be socialist, can be environmentalist, can be conservative, can be nationalist. You can have all sorts of beliefs, and you ought to have an electoral system that allows for the expression of that plurality in both our councils and inside Parliament as well. It's only us in North America now, pretty much, that still has this ridiculous system. And just from the Lib Dems perspective, in the last general election, we got 12% of the vote, I think it was, in the 2019 general election. So we should have something like 75 to 80 members of Parliament. And in any other European system, that's precisely what we would have. The Green Party would have more than Caroline Lucas as the member of Parliament. And actually, you know, English nationalism, which I don't like, would have a voice in Parliament as well. And I think they should. So first past the post, I think, is totally out of date. It's been out of date for a long time. But it is one of the tragedies of the progressive side of politics that we've allowed that system to be perpetuated, largely because, and I guess there are some Labour supporters on this conversation, at the moment, because the Labour Party thinks their turn will come eventually. Whereas if you look at the last 120 years or so, the Conservative Party's been in government for far too much of that time over the last century or so, but has never had the majority support of the electorate to be in power. And if we're not going to have a conservative future, and none of us want that, then it is going to require movement, I'm afraid to say, by the Labour Party to recognise that first past the post probably isn't going to give them their turn again on their own, because the situation in Scotland has completely changed. When I was an MP and Gordon Brown was Prime Minister in my second term, you know, the Labour Party had, I think it was something like 46 or 47 of the 59 MPs in Scotland. They now have a handful, if that. I think it may only be one, in fact, after the 2019 general election. They've also lost, you know, a swathe of what they call the Red Wall in the north of England to English nationalism, Toryism in the 2019 general election. So I don't think the Labour Party is going to come back into power on its own, certainly not in one election. So what, you know, I personally favour, and I have said this many times over several electoral cycles, there should be some soft cooperation in between the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats, and the Green Party in England, in order to make sure that we don't effectively fire at each other all the time and allow the Conservatives to win by default. Just a one-off soft deal that delivers electoral reform and then very quickly has an election for a new House of Commons under a new system.
I think, Stephen, you not only answered the next question on electoral reform, which is about whether you support a move to a more proportional voting system locally or nationally, which you clearly do, but also the next question, which is about, are you willing to work with other parties on common progressive goals?
Right, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. May have saved some time by jumping ahead.
Yeah. How would you see that working in the west of England?
Well, the Conservative Party does have the majority of MPs in this region. It doesn't have, interestingly, it doesn't have the most councillors. The Liberal Democrats have the most councillors across the west of England, but it's still not a fair representation of what people have voted for. So I do feel that there is scope for deals in future elections in between the three parties of the centre left, and in order to do that, there needs to be some magnanimity on all sides. You know, we've probably all said terrible things about each other over the last 20 years if you've been around in politics, but I think we just have to forget some of that and recognise that we do have more in common than we like to acknowledge in public, and by cooperating, by not fighting each other in certain conservative-facing wards or constituencies, and Claire, constituency you fought, Thornbury and Yate, would be a classic example of that. You know, there are council wards in Bristol that are about to have their elections in 3 weeks' time, like Westbury and Henleaze, for instance, just up the road from where I live in St Andrews, that is never going to elect a Labour councillor, but is always on a knife edge in between Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. And quite often, in fact, not quite often, nearly always, the difference in between a Lib Dem being elected in Westbury and Henleaze or Conservative being elected in Henleaze is the Labour vote or the Green vote. And there'll be other wards in Bristol, Bishopsworth, to pick an example, where perhaps there would be scope for cooperation to make sure a Labour councillor was elected and not a Conservative. You know, we can look at the map and think of the obvious places where dealing with each other in a cooperative way might pay off, and accept that in some places there might not be, and we might want to put up candidates to express our own particular viewpoints. But if we don't cooperate at all, we're not going to get electoral reform. A Conservative Party now is not going to be interested in introducing it when it sees a divided and weak opposition parties.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. So now I'm going to move on to the Green New Deal. How committed are you to implementing a Green New Deal, such as that proposed by the cross-parliamentary group?
I don't know the details about what that parliamentary group have come up with, and I think people mean different things by a Green New Deal. But you know, I am absolutely determined that we have a greener future in the west of England. And in my manifesto, I mentioned the Centre for Green Technological Excellence. I'm in support of bus franchising. I want to make sure that we retrofit older houses in order to deal with climate change. If we only concentrate on how we build new houses, we'll never reduce the emissions from our own housing stock, which is the biggest contributor, in fact, to greenhouse gases, bigger than transport. So in the west of England, there is a lot of things we could be doing in order to have a green future and to train people for those green jobs of the future as well. So I would have a conversation with all the training providers, with the three further education colleges that are currently in the west of England and Western College as well, to make sure that we're aligning the future needs of the workforce, to make sure that we are training people to do retrofitting, we are training people in installing the green energy methods, whether it's in the home or whether it's solar farms, wind farms, or whatever. And there is just so much that we can do.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think at that point we'll switch to questions from members of the audience, and I'm hoping I'm going to get. So I'm looking for the people who've started their question with a Q, aren't I? Okay. So I'm just scrolling through here. Okay, so the first question is on the climate emergency, and it's from Rob. I can see your name starts with BR, and I can't see beyond that, I'm afraid. Would you like to unmute and join and ask your question?
I can unmute, but yeah, actually I can do it now. It's okay. I did put in the chat that I can't probably ask the question live, but it's okay now. It's gone quiet. So the question is, given the climate emergency and transport being the only emission sector that is rising or staying steady, we need a massive shift from using cars for journeys to non-car journeys. So what concrete actions will you take to reduce the number of cars in your term of office?
Well, Rob B, I can't see you, but I actually recognise your voice. It's Rob Breyer, isn't it? Former Green Party councillor. Yeah, we do have to reduce the impact of cars on our towns and cities. You know, a lot of people are talking about how transformational switching from fossil fuel propelled cars is going to be, or how driverless cars are going to be transformational as well. And both of those things, I think, will bring huge advantages. But the advantages will not be that good if we still have the same number of vehicles on the road, or indeed that people think that now it's clean and now you don't have to learn to drive. Maybe you can have even more vehicles. I think that would be a disaster, because we'd have lots of congestion, we'd have lots of frustration, and both of those are not good either for mental health or indeed for productivity of the economy. So we have to wean people off the assumption that the car is always the preferred method of traveling about, that the car is something that you must aspire to owning, and every individual in your house owning as well. I live on a busy residential street in St Andrews, where some of my neighbours might have 3 or 4 vehicles, and that's clearly not sensible. If every household did that, it would be even more impossible to park in this region. So one of the ideas that I've got in my manifesto is that every major street, sort of more than 50 houses in Bristol, Bath and some of the major towns, should have street space set aside for an electric car club vehicle. So in a street of, say, 100 houses, you could have 2 spaces that are dedicated with a charging point for a car club, which everyone in that street and some neighbouring streets is able to subscribe to, so that you can feel that you can have a nice vehicle, you can use it for going shopping, whatever it is you need to do, but you don't need that second vehicle or that third vehicle. Or maybe when you come to renew the natural life cycle of your own car, perhaps you don't need to. And you only need a car club in order to travel around. And I've said that every town, every sort of small town and village, because there's over 100 of those in the west of England, should have an electric car club with a dedicated space, in the parish hall car park or whatever in rural areas. I am also in favour of setting aside street space for more bike hangers. I think cycling is underutilized in both of our cities, not just because of the topography. I think that is a factor in both Bristol and Bath, but the fact that a lot of people live in flats, they don't have anywhere where they can safely store a bicycle, so they don't get one in the first place. Whereas I think if you set aside space for a secure bike hanger in most streets, then I think more people would be able to get a bike and would have the confidence that it was going to be stored securely overnight. I also want to transition all of our major car parks, particularly our multi-stories, into multi-purpose transport centres. So let's just say Cabot Circus car park, for instance. I would set aside a floor of that to be used for secure bike or scooter parking for people, where it's dry, where it's secure, where it's protected by security cameras. And if you've made a significant investment in a bike and you're working in hospitality or retail and your bike is nicked, that is pretty devastating for you. So we have to make sure that not only do we have safe cycle routes for people, but give people the confidence that their bike will be secure while they're at work or while they're at leisure, whatever it is that they're doing. So I think there's lots of things we could do to reduce dependence on the car. And the tragedy is in this region, we've not done some of the easy things so far.
Thanks, Stephen. Now I'd like to turn to...
Can I just follow up on that? Is that right? Just a quick follow-up.
Very quickly, we've got quite a few questions here.
Because that's what's happened the last 2 nights, so I'm just assuming it was. So it's really good, actually, what you said. I completely agree with everything you said. Brilliant ideas. I just wonder about a bigger sort of ticket thing, because these are good things on the local level, on the small level. But what about on the macro level? What do we need to do to kind of reduce the number of cars?
Yeah, well,
across the whole
I
region?
wrote there's a book, you can Google it, called The Green Book, which was published in 2013. It's a liberal book, so everyone in there is either a Liberal Democrat or is a small L Liberal. And I wrote the chapter on green taxes, and in particular made the case for road user pricing. So not congestion charging, not the clean air zone sort of charging that Bath has just introduced and Bristol at some point may introduce later this year, because that's a flat toll charge for entering a particular area. Whereas road user pricing would use the technology that's now available to charge people according to the type of vehicle they've got, according to the time of day that they're traveling, and the area that they're traveling as well, and would have different pricing structures in order to tweak people's behavior throughout the day. I think that's the way that you can switch demand out of cars and onto public transport. And the revenue from road user pricing, road user charging, whatever you want to call it, would replace fuel duty. I mean, fuel duty is an incredibly blunt instrument. It's a flat rate that you pay at the petrol pump effectively, whether you live in the Orkney Islands or the centre of Bristol. So it's not an environmental tax at all, despite the excuses of many national governments over the years by saying they've ratcheted up fuel duty in order to be more environmental. It doesn't really change behaviour at all, because you've got no choice about the amount that you're paying. But road user pricing would be quite transformational, and I think it will happen at some point in the future. And of course, as cars and vehicles do start to switch away from fuel, there's going to have to be a fiscal replacement for fuel duty anyway. And I think road user pricing is an idea that suddenly everyone will be in favour of, but some of us have been in favour of it for quite a long time.
Thank you very much. Is that okay?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure whether that's a concrete action. You said it will happen eventually. Is that a sort of commitment, or is it more like I used to be a politician.
I'm never going to please you. we know
no,
this.
no,
This is
no.
what I was saying earlier. If we keep firing at each other, we'll never get anywhere.
No, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I think it's great stuff. I'm just wondering what you think is actually the thing you're going to do. Is that the thing you're going to do, or is that just an idea? Do you know what I mean?
It's not an idea. I mean, it's a concept that would definitely work. And as I've written about it 7 years ago, so I've been in favour of it for a long time. But it would need legislation. It would need legislation in order to bring it into effect. One of the things that a regional mayor can do is ask for more powers to be devolved from central government. I mentioned earlier that I'd like to have a trial in the region on UBI. I'd like complete control of business rates to be devolved to the west of England. I'd like a tourist tax to be introduced in the west of England, in Bath and Bristol, and we could use the proceeds to reinvest in the visitor economy. So there are lots of things I'd like to be devolved from central government that we can't do at the moment. Road user pricing would probably be quite difficult to devolve just to this geographical area. So I suspect it would have to be introduced on a national basis and scrap fuel duty and VAT on petrol and diesel at the same time. So I think that's, unfortunately, that is still something that will have to be done at the national level.
Okay.
That's my phone.
Thanks, Stephen. I think
landline that hardly ever rings.
Thanks for those questions, Rob. And I think I'm going to move us on now. The next question is from Alison Allen, and it's a question about divesting the Avon pension from fossil fuels.
Hello, Stephen. Both WECA and Bristol City Council have pledged to become zero carbon by 2030, including a promise to stop exporting our footprint to the global south. Our UK government has acknowledged that we are heading towards 3C. So what will you do to ensure the Avon Pension Fund divests from companies which are causing global warming and rainforest destruction?
Thanks, Alison. I've previously supported various campaigns over the years to make sure that not just the Avon Pension Fund, but a lot of pension funds use the vast resources at their disposal in a more holistic way. And lots of other sort of national pension funds from other countries do take a long-term investment view and invest in things that are for the public good in their own countries. Our pension funds in this country sort of follow the sort of short-termism attitude of the City of London, and often aren't investing in things that provide a good long-term return. And of course, that's what a pension should all be about, particularly as we now all live longer. If you've paid into a pension fund and you retire, in my case, 67, and you might live for another 20 or 30 years after that, you would like to think that what you've invested in effectively, the surplus that has generated your pension, was also funding activities that make sure that your future life while you're not working is sustainable and fair. So I've supported campaigns for divestment in the past. The obvious things, the early campaigns on the arms trade. Claire, I think, mentioned in her introduction that I got an award from the World Health Organization for anti-tobacco campaigning. So I've certainly for many, many years said that no pension fund should invest in Imperial Tobacco or BAT or any other tobacco companies, because they are merchants of death, and it's certainly not something a pension fund should be invested in, even though Imperial is a local Bristol company. And likewise on fossil depletion, I think there is a good case for divesting from many of those as well. And the reason I say there might be a good case is because there is a slight caveat. It depends what their current behavior is. So some energy companies are seeing the writing on the wall and are invested in hydrogen or other forms of cleaner energy going forward. If they're on that journey and they've got a program to switch their activity away from drilling for oil and gas and into a greener future, because ultimately they're going to have to be there. It's a question of whether they're there in 40 years or whether they're there in 10 years. So if some companies are committing to change their behavior and getting there in 10 years, you might want to encourage that. But if there are other companies, ExxonMobil or something, that still thinks it's drill baby going forward in Alaska or somewhere else, then certainly we wouldn't want any association with them. But bracketing all energy companies together, I think would be more difficult because there is difference, and we want to encourage that difference.
Thank you, Stephen. Did you want to come back, Alison?
I was impressed with the answer, but I feel that it lacked urgency. This is happening. The ice caps are melting. We haven't got time to pick and choose between energy companies. We've got to be really, really radical. They've got cameras inside both the North and South Pole, and there are warm areas right in the bottom. We'll be lucky if we don't get overcome by an iceberg in 10 years' time.
I understand that, yeah. But divestment itself doesn't change their behaviour.
Thank you.
Okay. The next question I've got, I've been asked if I will read it out. In fact, I've been asked if it would be okay if I read out all the questions, because we have someone on the call who is lip reading, and Stephen and I are both spotlighted, but other people aren't, and it's not necessarily possible to see. So I hope everyone will be happy with that. The next question is about Stephen's role in the coalition government regarding big building regulations. Given that role, the questioner believes that you ignored specialist advice, saying that issues were not urgent relating to.
Whose question is that?
Sorry?
Whose question? Who is asking that?
Lee Starr Elliott.
Who is a Labour Party candidate? Yeah, I mean this is part of the problem. Going back earlier, if you start making false allegations about people, then we're never going to get anywhere, and only one party benefits from doing that. Mr. Starr earlier used to be so abusive to me on social media that I had to block him.
Okay, so
nothing I've said in that question isn't in public in the public papers that you answered the question to. So can you please answer the question rather than avoid it?
do you wish to say anything else, Stephen, about your role in this issue?
Well, I don't think it's helpful to go into a whole discussion about, and it's not fair, and it's not the purpose of this hustings. This man is a Labour Party candidate. So he's not asking this question to be helpful or illuminating to anybody. There is an inquiry going on into the Grenfell fire incident. Every single minister going back to 1997 who's been housing minister, including me, has submitted written evidence to that inquiry, and they've asked written questions as well. And there's going to be oral evidence sessions in October this year. We're all forbidden to talk about it for very obvious reasons. It's a judicial inquiry on an incredibly sensitive issue. So Labour candidates chucking...
You might want to get that right. I'm not a candidate.
Well, I think you might have been deselected recently or something. I don't know. But you certainly were a Labour candidate for Hengrove, I think, until recently.
Okay.
What did you say?
Right. So I'll move on then to Eileen McCaughlin, who asks, what distinguishes you from the Greens?
Well, one thing that distinguishes me is that I've had that national government experience in order to make a success of this role. This is discussion about who is the best person to be mayor of the West of England in order to make a difference in this region. And if you look at the successful mayors or the better known mayors, the Mayor of London or mayors of Greater Manchester or Merseyside, what they all have in common is that they've all been in Parliament and have been government ministers in terms of Andy Burnham and Sadiq Khan in London. So understand how the Westminster system works and how you can get the best possible deal for your region. Whether it's to do with the electoral system or any other reason, the Green Party hasn't been in power, so that doesn't have that experience. I think also there is a philosophical difference. If I can widen it out, I am a Green, and there will be Greens in the Labour Party as well as obviously Greens in the Green Party. There'll be Greens in Plaid Cymru and the SNP, and actually there are environmentalists and Greens inside the Conservative Party as well. But I'm a Liberal Green. That means I do want to transition us to a much more sustainable future, but want to do it in a way that brings people along with that agenda and doesn't force people to do things that they might not be comfortable with doing. Whereas I think the Green Party is a much more authoritarian party. A lot of the people in the Green Party are anti-capitalist, socialist campaigners as well, with whom there would be quite a gap in between myself and other people who identify as Liberal Greens. So there are differences in approach, there are differences in experience, but I think there is also a philosophical difference in terms of how you engage with people and bring them along with your agenda rather than try and force them or shame them into behaving in the way that you want them to behave.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Did you want to come back on that, Eileen? No, I think
that was a very helpful answer.
Okay, thank you. I'll move then on to the question from Patrick Graham, which as we're reading them out now, I will read out. So it says, Dan Norris said in his Compass interview that franchising buses is a significant financial risk and the WECA budget is not publicly available. What's your view about the risks of franchising, if any, and how will you manage these?
Well, we can't go on as we are. I said earlier, Bath and Bristol have the worst public transport systems in the country. So the existing system, which is basically a free-for-all, where we take whatever First or Stagecoach or anybody else wants to give us, is all that we should accept. I don't think we can go on like that. Regulation of the bus system has always carried on in London. Thatcher wasn't so stupid when she abolished bus regulation in the 1980s. Everywhere else in England, she would be a catastrophe if it was abandoned in London. So it's carried on there and has been proven to work. It is true that the surplus from the tube, which was run profitably, helps TfL in London to subsidise bus services, and we wouldn't have that here, and nowhere else would have it either. The Manchester Tram network, I think, makes some money that's going to make it easier for Andy Burnham, if he's re-elected, to introduce bus franchising in Greater Manchester, but it's small potatoes compared to the surplus that in ordinary times that would be generated by the tube. So we have to craft a franchising system that works for the circumstances of the West of England. And it is true that it would require some subsidy from the public sector. WECA has both a revenue budget and a capital budget every year, and it has a 15 million a year capital budget that is at its discretion to spend. So I think the money that could be put on the table to make franchising work in this region could be capital. So you could, for instance, get First and any other operator who wants to work here to change their future investment plans for their buses so they get out of diesel buses a lot sooner than they're planning to do. Basically, at the moment, First have said they're not going to end diesel buses until 2035, whereas I want the West of England to be as clean and green as possible by 2030. So we could use the capital budget of WECA to enable cleaner buses on certain routes to be brought in a lot earlier than they would otherwise be. But yeah, it is a risk. But bus operators want to operate here. So if we say, in order to operate here, you're going to have more orbital services to connect people from South Gloucestershire into Southmead Hospital or the RUH in Bath. You're going to have more village bus services. You're going to have more night bus services in Bath and Bristol as well. They're either going to walk away and say, oh, we're not going to trade in your region, or they're going to think, okay, the game's up. We've had it good for quite a long time. We're going to just have to live with this new regulatory environment. So I think we can introduce franchising. This is an area with, if you include North Somerset, which would have to be brought into the arrangement, over 1 million people who travel into the three major centres, Western Bath and Bristol. And it can still be a profitable enterprise for bus companies, even under a strict regulatory system that franchising would allow us to do. So I think Dan Norris has been far too timid, to be honest.
Okay. The next question is from David Redgewell, and it is, what are Steve's views on improvements on making public transport safe on buses and trains with the Police and Crime Commissioner?
Say that again, as I just missed the first.
I'm not sure I quite captured the question there. I think David is asking for your view on improvements on public transport to make people safe on buses and trains with the Police and Crime Commissioner, working with the Police and Crime Commissioner perhaps. We can come to David for clarification.
I suppose the simple answer to that is yes. I mean, the British Transport Police operates on the rail system, and I assume they come under the Avon and Somerset Police and Crime Commission. I'm not sure, because the British Transport Police is a national organisation, so I actually don't know who has oversight over what they do. It may be the Department of Transport or the Home Office with the BTP. I'm afraid I don't know that. Our Police and Crime Commissioner candidate, Helen Shearer, probably does know, and if she's elected and I'm elected, then there's lots of things that we'd have to work together on, including bike theft, enforcement of bad parking on pavements, people parking, blocking cycle lanes. There's a lot of things the local police, let alone the British Transport Police, could be doing in order to make it safer for people to walk and cycle around. So there's lots of things I'd like to cooperate with the next Police and Crime Commissioner on.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. David, did you want to come back on that?
I just wanted to make a point. I think we've seen this thing clear in Hartcliffe. We saw a bit in Yate a year or so ago, but in Hartcliffe recently, Stephen, we've had really attacks on bus drivers, buses, broken glass windows, and all sorts of antisocial behaviour. Andy Burnham, Andy Streets, they have dedicated officers, as you're correctly right, from the British Transport Police and from their local police, which would be the Avon Somerset Police. And I think there's a need in our area to bring that together more to make sure we deal with the antisocial behaviour around the public transport. And as you probably know, like I know as a gay man, we've had hate crime on buses with gay passengers. We've had hate crime on buses with BME passengers. We just need to really make sure that the public transport's safe in the WECA and North Somerset area. And I think the only reason on the franchise thing is people are getting hesitant is you may want to have a look at yourself, Stephen. They've just put out bus Build Back Better, and the government's laid out some criteria making franchising their last resort. But you're absolutely right. They want to bring buses into council control, but they want to do it via advanced quality partnerships. But it's a moot point, whether it's franchising or whether it's advanced quality partnership. It still means WECA take control of the buses as they are now, as Claire knows, because they're funding everything for the Department for Transport. So it probably is a bit of tweaking and looking at, because we've got to have a planning position, Claire and Stephen, and you found out myself this yesterday, by the way, just to clarify it, by April next year and operational, and we've got to control first the Stagecoach's bus networks. So with 20 officers at WECA, there's a huge amount of work to do. I wish you well, Stephen, if you get there. It's a lot of hard work.
Indeed, there's a lot of ground to make up.
And thank you very much, David. And on that note, I'm afraid we've run out of time for the questions. So I'm now going to hand back to Compass, who I believe are going to be showing us a short presentation about WECA voting. So if I can just hand back to Eileen.
I'm just going to share my screen to just go through a little bit about the actual voting method for the mayoral, regional mayor elections. So just bear with me while I share my screen. Can everybody see that? Yeah. Okay. So the actual regional mayor and the Bristol mayor and the police crime commissioner are not actually your normal just one cross against each like they are for regular councillor voting. I've gone on the wrong side. So in the election, you can vote for two candidates in order of preference. If one candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, then they'll just get straight through. But if no candidate receives more than 50% of the first preference votes, the top two go forward to the final count. And any other candidates who are not in the top two are eliminated. And therein lies a tale about how your next vote, your second vote, can be wasted. To make your vote count, we're suggesting that you first choose the candidate that you want, and for your second choice, that you choose someone who you think also stands a chance of making it to the top two and is acceptable to you. So our message is first, choose with your heart, and for your second vote, choose with your head. This is what the actual ballot paper will look like. So rather than getting ones and twos, you get two columns. And in the first column, you mark an X for your first choice. And in the second column, you mark an X for your second choice. But basically, if your second choice is for somebody who doesn't make it into the top two, it will just end up in the bin. So you might really want to vote for somebody, but if you really think they haven't got a chance at all of being in the top two, that second vote will not get counted. In the last election, the scale of that problem was quite large. 56% of second votes were not counted, and that, over half of the electorate. So we're urging you to use your first vote with your heart, but really think a bit more, and for the second vote, vote with your head. We have graphics on this on our YouTube channel. So if you search for YouTube Compass Bristol and West, there's a little video that will go through this for you again if it didn't quite make sense. But the real message is, please think about this before you arrive at the polling station, and really, really think carefully about where you cast your second vote. And I'll pass over to Rachel.
Thank you, Aileen. Thank you for going through that. Just before we wrap up, and I just give a little bit more information about how Compass works locally and nationally. Stephen, I just wondered if there was anything you wanted to add. I see you've put a link to your manifesto in the chat. Thank you for that, because as you said, we haven't had time to cover many issues that we get a chance to discuss. So please note that Stephen's put a link to his manifesto. Just wanted to give you the opportunity to say if there's anything more you want to add, Stephen.
That is in great detail. Just to comment on that last slide. One of the frustrating things about this election is not only explaining what the Mayor of the West of England is, because the incumbent hasn't really done that in the last 4 years, but the voting system is dreadful. I mean, we discussed first past the post earlier. This supplementary vote system is just slightly better than first past the post. What you were just describing is really the alternative votes, where you can use your heart for your first vote, and you can number first, second, third, fourth, fifth, write down the ballot paper. The supplementary vote, I think it was an invention of Mr. Plant, I think his name was, for Jack Straw in the first Labour government, Blair government. Just to move one step away from first past the post for mayoral elections. But really, people need to think about, in this region, the Tories are not going to win outright. It's one of the very few regions where nobody will win outright on the first ballot. So the second votes really do count. And I think people need to think about who is the person most likely to defeat the Tory in the second round, given that they're going to get lots of second preferences. You mentioned 56% of the second preferences weren't counted in 2017. That's because a lot of them were for me, and of course I was knocked out. But just by 1.8%, I missed being in the runoff in 2017. If I'd been in the runoff, and not Leslie Mansell, who was the Labour candidate at the time, I would have won, and we wouldn't have had a Tory mayor for the last 4 years. So I think people need to think very carefully about the first and the second preference, and think about, it's a given that the Tory, given the geography, is going to be in that second round. Who's most likely to defeat him? Is it the Labour candidate or is it the Lib Dem candidate, realistically? Across the West of England, Bristol is different, but across the West of England, is it the Lib Dem or is it the Labour candidate who's most likely to have the broad support to sweep past the Tory in the second round?
Thank you very much, Stephen. So just to sum up, as I said, this event has been hosted by Compass Bristol and West Group. Compass operates at both local and national level. Nationally, Compass hosts some great fortnightly discussions, produces podcasts, and has some really high quality publications. So I would urge people to check out their website, and we've put information in the chat on that. Locally, groups like the local Compass Bristol and West Group are a really good way to put ideas into action and link up with other like-minded people. We know there are a lot of progressives out there, some in parties and some independent. We need to find each other and work together on a progressive alliance. So our local group meets monthly. We have representation from Labour, from Greens, from Liberal Democrats and Independent. And we focus on the areas that we've discussed tonight about universal basic income, building a progressive alliance, electoral reform and the Green New Deal. And we really want to work together on areas of local collaboration. So please get in touch with us by Facebook or email. We'd really like to hear from you. Details in the chat. So I think it only remains for me to thank Stephen and Claire for their time tonight. It's been a really useful and fascinating discussion. 3 weeks to go till the election. Let's get out there, not only for obviously for the Metro Mayor, but also for the Police and Crime Commissioner, local councillors and the Bristol Mayor. Let's get progressive candidates elected and form a progressive alliance. So Thank you all for your time. Stephen and Claire, thank you particularly. And everybody have a great evening. Thank you.